Today I'm going to be going over Chapter 5 and 6 respectively. Chapter 5 titled White Shame, Responsibility and Moral Emotions. In this chapter we look at a philosopher called Daniel Haggerty. And Daniel Haggerty has this notion that guilt and moral shame are two separate entities. These entities must be understood in separate ways so we can really understand what responsibility and moral emotions are, especially when it comes to white guilt. In this chapter, we look to explore a concept that combines both of these in a way that makes it so not one is thought of more than the other. What Haggerty says is that whiteness operates with an imperversed concept of responsibility that overemphasizes guilt and underemphasizes moral shame. By that he means that guilt and moral shame are two separate things and that the feelings and what we do for each of them is different. There are many philosophers that focus on the moral psychology and the political philosophy of guilt and shame. Tommy Shelby argues that philosophy analysis of racism should focus on the political reality. For Shelby, ideology, not an individual morality, should be primary in our thinking about racism. Lawrence Blum disagrees. For him, in order to preserve the strong commodity forced racism, we must consider it primarily as a matter of individual immorality. Blum defines racism as a personal antipathy toward people who are perceived to be one of our races. Both, however, are considered to be flawed because one leaves no room for emotion, and the other has racism as a moral psychology, and for the other, there's no room for ideology. In American liberalism, there is an individualism and ideology formed that by moral psychologies that we overemphasize guilt and underemphasize moral shame. Basically, what that means is that white people ignore responsibility for racism, in a sense. I'll get more into detail on that later. Moral psychology, though, refers to our disposition to act in accordance with a sense of justice and to feel guilt and shame when we recognize that we have violated norms of justice. These norms are what we think as a rational human being to be good and not good and true and not true. From here we go on to separate the ideas of guilt and shame. Guilt is something that we refer to as more of an action and consequence. Guilt we fear to be being punished for our actions by an impersonal authority. It is more self-punishing anger, and we fear consequences. It's more of a perception that we've done something wrong over which we have had control or we should have had control over. Shame, on the other hand, is self. It's more about the self and is directed towards yourself. Shame is an abandonment. It's an evaluation of our character and is a loss. And we fear shame because we fear loss of respect, love, and in the eyes of our community. The difference between guilt and shame is guilt can be a force of burden, and shame is seen as a person we feel who we ought to be, as in a sense where we feel like we should be better than what we're doing, and if we're not, we don't feel like that's a good thing. That's what differentiates guilt and shame. That guilt is more of an action and a fear of your action, and a shame is more of how do you look in the eyes of society. We like to avoid guilt, and it is motivated by fear and punishment, and a desire to avoid shame is motivated by fear of disapproval. E.R. Dodds says that shame is the strongest moral force, not God himself. everyone wants the respect from a public opinion, and it's very important for everyone to feel like they're respected in the world. That's just something that humans tend to lead towards. Um, Douglas Carn and Bernard Williams argue that Western cultures attempt to separate guilt and shame, and this is smart because guilt and shame are two separate entities, and with this we can better formulate a kind of a formula of why we are racist and what the idea of white guilt is. White guilt and the American ideology is the labeling of an emotion in a given culture can make the difference of what the emotion actually is. So that being said, basically how other people view things and how other things around you are, what the rules are and what the status quo is, that is what's going to change how things are perceived. In a sense, that is how an emotion turns out. So you go to institutional white guilt. We have two types of. We have institutional and liberal. Institutional white guilt is those who feel no personal or collective race-based guilt, vaguely threatened, and they're vaguely threatened by the racist label. For this is more like policies that I guess politicians and any type of policy made by a community that would be considered institutional white guilt, that it's not us, it's everyone as a whole, and we shouldn't feel responsible individually for those actions. They're not personal. Liberal white guilt, on the other hand, is an individual whiteness. It bears personal moral guilt. If we are not personally or directly doing anything to cause harm, then we are not personally responsible. That is the idea of liberal guilt, white guilt. From here, we go on to explain that there is a difference between white guilt and white shame. A white shame are grounds of feeling shame for being white in America. All these tie into institutional liberal because if you have these, you should be able to look at, oh, you feel kind of bad for your race as a whole because this is what they're doing to quote unquote African Americans. We institutionalize guilt and we liberalize guilt just so we have a way of ignoring what is right in front of us. And a quote that really stuck out to me in this chapter was that we are responsible when we do nothing. This reminded me of the Holocaust when Jewish people were being slaughtered and destroyed in these concentration camps because, like everyone said, the white people did nothing. And the idea of this chapter is to make us realize that there are reasons why white Americans overemphasize guilt and underemphasize moral shame, because moral shame is really what will change the person's individual perspective on what racism is. With this being said, it is important that we know the difference between guilt and shame, and that we have a responsibility to acknowledge and do something about them. From this, he believes that the white American people are tainted. It's kind of a pollution, the idea that we are upset with our race as a whole, and that one person does something, such as in the instance from the chapter is rape. If men are accused of rape, as a man, I feel horrible for being a man because I can't believe that someone else would do such a thing. And that is considered taint. And white people feel this when they understand that racism is partly their fault, even if they're not racism morally, or even if they do feel moral shame, they will feel taint for their species as a whole. The last thing of this chapter that really ties all together is that justice is necessary to keep order between people. A sense of shame is necessary to establish bonds of friendship. Without sense of shame, without fear of losing the respect and affection of others, there can be no gratitude, no remorse, and no bonds of friendship that unite us. This being said, it is very important for us to realize what is right in front of us and to understand the difference between doing something and feeling guilty for causing that, and then sitting by and just being a bystander and having nothing done for it. just like they did in the Holocaust. These people, the good people, did nothing. So this is what I got out of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 will be talked about in a couple of seconds, in a minute. So we'll get back to that as soon as I get ready with my display. Okay, now we are at Chapter 6, and we're going to be talking about the very controversial topic of, is racial profiling just? Making criminal justice policy in the original position. Okay, before we go on with this, we're going to have to talk about what the original position is, and for that we have to go to the introduction. Just found out introductions are very important to read. They help and give you a lot of information in a very small period of time. Alright, so this article is basically going to be about Jeffrey Ryman. He is a William Fraser McDowell Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Social Policy at American University. Okay, in this chapter, Ryman investigates the justice of racial profiling. Okay, that's what this chapter is going to be about. From this, he makes the argument from the idea of the original position. Okay, now the original position is John Rawls had the idea, John Rawls' idea of the original position, which is an imagined state of mind that divorces the thinker from all continent factors of one's life. And by continent factors, he means age, gender, ability, race, so on, to get at the decisions that are most equitable and fair. So basically, to think of everything as like where it shouldn't define you for what you are. And you know what I mean? Like everyone's almost equal, everyone's like thinking the same like way, but it's just that there's nothing like about you. There's no continent factor. That's the perfect word that he has for it. But that's what the original position is. So in Chapter 6, we start with defining a problem. Okay? Where we're going to talk about racial profiling as any police-initiated action that relies on race, ethnicity, or natural origin, and not merely on the behavior of an individual. That is what we're going to look at racial profiling as. And that was quoted by Matthias Rees and Richard Zuchhauser as racial profiling. So in Chapter 6, we talk about what racial profiling is. So anyway, we go on to say in this chapter that we're going to add a little something different to the definition of racial profiling. Racial profiling is any policy-initiated action that relies on race or color as a rough indicator of race, which was what we added to the definition from, I want to say, Reis and Zuchhauser. The ethnicity or national origin, and not merely on behavior of an individual. Again, a policy-initiated action that relies on race or color or rough indicator of race, ethnicity, or natural origin, and not merely on the behavior of an individual. That's what racial profiling is. So that's how we have to look at it when we talk about racial profiling for the rest of the chapter. Yep. John Rawls. So most of this chapter goes on to set the stage of a scenario where everything is, what I want to say, balanced. When we talk about the original position is why the original position we go on to talk about. Basically, the original position is what we think of as a thought experiment. Okay? It imagines a group of individuals who represent who we are. Okay, so it's an idea that it's an imagination that we think of in our heads, and then we think of a reality. So in the original position, at least we take a different stance of the original position in this argument. We go on to say that everyone in this original position is a reasonable person. They understand the idea that crime is not good. We want to be safe. You know, everything that a normal human rational person would think. That's what everyone in this scenario is. However, they are They do not know each other's race. They do not know each other's ethnicity. They're neutral in that fact. So now we're throwing in the fact that racial profiling does not, race does not exist, or ethnicity, anything that could be controversial, because we were talking about, that's why we broadened the definition of racial profiling. We want to understand that it's not just like by color, anything that could be racial is eliminated. So we go on to say that in these circumstances, is racial profiling just? Okay, so we're setting the stage to ask these questions. And the idea is that anything that we choose in this original position would be reasonable by any standard, that no one would take it too far to ignore someone's rights. Or however, if someone's, what we like to say is inconveniencing, is what we like to go on about, but I'll get into that later. The idea that everything in the original position would find most rational to choose to be governed by, and on the assumption that everyone follows the rules. So everyone's good inherently, but some people do slip out and they know it, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that's what we're taking in the original position. It's very, very tricky to explain, but I feel like if you just understand that if it is like now and everyone just gets rid of the race and ethnicity, that in the perfect world, if we had these rules, would they be considered unjust or not good? So we're going to go talk about now racial profiling without racism. In this chapter, we're going to say that racial profiling without racism, he goes to explain we go on with the idea, we set up again the stage. Oh shit, my speaker turned off. What's up? Okay. Now we're going to talk about another, what we like to call mind experiment, or thought experiment. Thought experiment. We're going to talk about racial profiling without racism, okay? This is the idea that we set the stage for this article, or part of the article, stating that the parties in our original position know that they live in a society with laws that are roughly just, but that some people break them, okay? Fair enough to think. That's a very reasonable sense to think of things. I mean, this is what we would think. You know, remember, mind thought is putting a reality that you think into a situation, a hypothetical situation. They know that they live in a society with a diverse population made up of different races. Okay, obviously, you all know we have different races. There's no racism in the sense of either racial discrimination or racist attitudes. Okay, this is just the stage we're setting. It's not true. We do obviously know there's racism. However, we're just trying to create a world where we can put things so things are fair. We can analyze them with a clean slate. Is what we're trying to do here. Okay, so we asked the question: would it be rational for these parties to know which race they belong to or whatnot? Because there is no racial discrimination or racist attitudes. Remember, there's nothing like that. It's a perfect world. Would it be knowledgeable to know that although they know their races, would it be okay for them to be racially profiled? Okay, so like knowing that their races are statistically more likely to commit crimes than other members of other races. Okay, so we come to the conclusion that it's okay for that to be happening because there's no actual racist. So like that's not the issue anymore. It's just basically on statistics. Even though it's race, it's still based on statistics. It's fair. It's reasonable. They're setting the stage that it basically everyone in society understands that harm and crime is a harm. Okay, not to just an individual, but to society. It's bad, it's just not good. So we established that because it makes it easier to understand what we're going to throw against it now. So we're going to think about racial profiling, and the people in this party, they do understand that there are limits to racial profiling. They don't want it, quote unquote. We do not want criminal investigation to be so open-ended that it erodes citizens' rights of privacy or becomes a threat to an individual liberty comparable to that posed by the crime aims to combat. Basically, it's not overstepping boundaries. It wouldn't be like, basically, if you're, I don't know, basically how bad the crime is how bad they're going to invade your privacy. That's what it's saying. And actually, what it says here now makes maybe really think of everything together more so, is that the original position yields guidelines. Okay, it sets these guidelines and these rules that you almost have to follow, and they're not yes or no questions, so there's not a right or wrong. It's just, you kind of just have to go because that's the way the track's going to take you, because it's so straight, it's just going to go straight. So, with that in mind, we look at racial profiling itself. And we set 3 stages, or 3 guidelines that we talk about this. Okay, the 3 guidelines. They're actually inconveniencing the innocent on general grounds, and inconveniencing the innocent on grounds of race. Okay, I'm going to get into these one by one specifically. They're a little tricky to understand, but I think I can explain them. Okay, so these are basically talking about our parties, people who are in our imaginary world, all right, our thought experiment. Parties know that in the nature of things, there is almost always more looking than finding. Criminal investigations must inconvenience innocent people. Okay, like you need to get in. Like I said, inconveniencing the innocent. Okay, so if you're innocent, if you're gonna be searched for someone else that stole something. Okay, you understand that it's gonna. You agree to those rules. They may search you and may waste your time. You're not gonna be happy about it, but that's what you understand that could happen. Okay. We understand that it's needed for this to be fair, so that we can have a justice system that can get the bad guys, because like maybe down the second or third person, they actually catch the guy who stole something, and everyone's all happy that they caught the robber. No one's thinking about like, oh, they just invaded my privacy now. But like, if they takes them a while or they don't, then you feel like, oh, this sucks, and you're invading my privacy. Okay, we understand these moral boundaries. Okay, so and then we go on to say that inconveniencing the innocent on general grounds. Okay. This is where it becomes a little different. The parties know that criminal investigation, unlike arrest and conviction, must necessarily be guided by general factors and cannot, in nature of things, be based upon probable cause or evidence of guilt. Okay. We understand that in this, scenario, we establish that the parties of this experiment conclude that the degree of generality of the factors must be proportionate to the gravity of the crime being investigated. So, like I said before, it depends on how bad the crime is how bad they're going to inconvenience you, or like pat you down, search you hard, or if like someone has like a gun on them, they know, and you get pulled over, they might be a little more, snippy with you, because there is a possibility that you are that guy with that stolen weapon or whatnot. People are going to be on more alert. So that's the idea. Basically, on how bad the crime is how bad they're going to come on, and how bad it's going to kind of disturb your rights a little, maybe, possibly, but not to the extent where it's unjust, because that's what we're setting the stage here for. And we're going to understand that inconveniencing the innocent on the grounds of race, because we understand that, like we said before, there is a higher crime rate on certain races. Okay, we understand this, and the parties know that they're used to help. Okay, and in this scenario, the parties will conclude that the use of racial categories can be in everyone's interest and where it is acceptable. So it's okay, because we go on to say that it's okay because they all know that they belong to racial categories, but in everyone's interest, everyone can commit crimes. Sometimes this is a world we have set the stage for in the original position, so it's okay to compare this to that, because in overall state of mind, the way that they believe that, how would I explain this again? Is they're in the neutral state of mind. There's no racism right now. There's no racism. So like it doesn't matter. It's like they're not like they're picking on their specific racist because of racism. There's not that anymore. That's why these inconveniencing the grounds of race is okay, because there isn't such thing as racism. No one's being inconvenienced because everyone is quote unquote better off, and his function is to serve everyone's interests. Everyone's interests are being served in this scenario right now, which is why we come to conclude that racial profiling can be just. It is not instinctively unjust. So we believe that racial profiling is, in principle, morally permissible. This is what we use. So yeah, it's somewhat okay. Next, we go on to talk about racial profiling in the original position with racism. Okay, now everyone knows we created the perfect world again, and blah blah blah, that there is such thing as racism. Basically, what we live in the United States now. Okay, we are comparing these. Sorry, just want to adjust. We're comparing this scenario to basically what the United States is. There is racism. There's no question about it. We've established this in chapters before. It does exist. It's there. Blah blah blah. Okay, so this is the world we've established. Okay. Now our parties know that they are considering racial profiling in a society very much like the contemporary United States. It is marked by racism, both in the form of discrimination against African Americans and in the form of negative beliefs and attitudes about them. Okay, so we're going to establish that. Okay, that is the original position we are taking in this chapter. Where did my notes go? Okay, sorry, I just lost my notes for a second. So we understand that there is racism, like I said, like the United States. So we want to say that Ries and Zuckhauser argue that racial profiling does not directly cause harm. Okay, we're talking about philosophers that try to explain the scenario as we have in the United States recently, and how they view that racial profiling is okay. Okay, this is what they support. They argue that racial profiling does not directly cause harm. Aside from the inconvenience that necessarily accompanies it, they contend that aside from the inconvenience, the harm that racial profiling causes in racists is an expressive harm. So he argues that it brings up something that happened before. So if they were a slave, just like if you call them like bad names and whatnot, it just brings up the hardship they had before. That's what they believe. But they believe that certain ideas they don't harm the person. It's hard to explain. It's expressive. There's not physical direct. Yeah, that's the word. Not direct harm. There's not direct harm there. It's like I'm not physically calling you out. Blah blah blah. I'm not being racist. That's what they argue. Okay, at least that's what Ries and Zuckhauser argue. It's about the words and how they bring out past history, and that's the racist part behind it. But that's just what he thinks. I don't necessarily agree. Okay, so we go on to context the argument, and we break it apart into two sections. Okay, we break it apart in one. He is a utilitarian. Sorry, we talk about how someone would look at it. So we go on to talk about a utilitarian. A utilitarian is basically someone who looks at facts and how do I explain? In this section of the article, we're talking about racial profiling in the original position with racism. Okay, so that's what we live in today in the United States. We understand that racism is around us. There's higher arrest rates on African Americans, and there is racism, and it exists. Okay, and that's what we've established in this uh, guidelines for the original position for this thought experiment. Okay, so we go back to see why Zellhauser and Rise think that racism is okay, and for them, racial profiling, not racism. I'm sorry, racial profiling is okay, is because it causes an expressive harm. It's not a direct harm. It does not take anything that you can physically like hurt you. Okay, not physically well, yes, physically but physically in your well-being. That's what I like to say. Well-being. Physically hurt your or not physically, can hurt your well-being. We go to put that in a sense because that's what they believe is why racial profiling is just. So we go on to counter the argument because they are what we like to call a utilitarian, and for them expressive harm doesn't make much of a sense because utilitarian believes that, okay, they add up everything. So if you hurt me once, it's going to hurt me that bad that time. Okay, you hurt me again, it's going to hurt me 2 times what I hurt before because it's now another time. That's how they look at things, and that's what their with Rises and Zuckhauser's arguments are based off of, in a sense. Okay, so we established that there's utilitarian and there's also a deontologist. A deontologist is someone who can separate the difference between hurt and harm. Okay, hurt is more of an emotional feeling. Okay, harm is something. It's an objective loss. It's not good. It's I'm not saying hurt is good, but harm. It harms you. It's like your well-being in a sense. Like it hurts when your girlfriend breaks up with you. I guess that sucks, but it's not harmful for the rest of your life. Hopefully, but you understand what I'm saying. That's what we go on to say that a deontologist is. However, in this party, we understand that there are higher arrest rates and whatnot, but we believe that it pushes them to. We understand that it pushes them to cause crime rates to be higher and whatnot. So we understand that there are more African Americans being arrested. So we set policies in this party. We set basically the perfect world where there are police, there are laws to keep police from being too brutal to certain races. We believe that there is a way to counter the bad that we're doing. So we go on to say that Ryer's argument is addressed specifically to reasons of how this claim that racial profiling is justifiable because it specifically benefits the very group targeted by the profiling. Thus, it does not squarely reach my argument, which is quote unquote, which is that it is in everyone's interest. Nonetheless, Lipperman's argument has an important implication for my own. That's where you go on to say, racial discrimination is responsible for heightening crime among African Americans. Okay? That's what it is. In the original position, they know that there's a way of reducing. That's not what we have yet come to. We have not come to that yet. So that's what we have in the conclusion of this. We concluded that we do push African Americans to do, or to inherently have higher crime rates. And racial profiling is just, but it's not meant to be unjust. It can be just, but it's unjust. It should be fixed, and I think we're working on it. But that's the idea of chapter 5.